Chapter 21. Professor Frowdisham. The morning after the funerals, Spittleworth knocked on the door of the king's apartments again and entered, carrying a lot of scrolls, which he let fall onto the table where the king sat. "Spittleworth," said Fred, who was still wearing his medal for outstanding bravery against the deadly Ickabog, and had dressed in a scarlet suit, the better to show it off. "These cakes aren't as good as usual." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Your Majesty," said Spittleworth. "I thought it right for the Widow Beamish to take a few days off work. These are the work of the under-pastry chef." "Well, they're chewy," said Fred, dropping half his Folderoy fancy back on the plate. "And what are all these scrolls?" "These, sire, are suggestions for improving the kingdom's defences against the Ickabog," said Spittleworth. "Excellent, excellent," said King Fred, moving the cakes and the teapot aside to make more room, as Spittleworth pulled up a chair. "The very first thing to be done, Your Majesty, was to find out as much as we could about the Ickabog itself, the better to discover how to defeat it." "Well, yes, but how, Spittleworth?" "The monster is a mystery. Everyone's thought it is fantasy all these years." "That, forgive me, is where Your Majesty is wrong," said Spittleworth. "By dint of ceaseless searching, I've managed to find the foremost Ickabog expert in all of Cornucopia. Lord Flapoon is waiting with him in the hall. With Your Majesty's permission—" Bring him in, do," said Fred excitedly. So Spittleworth left the room and returned shortly afterwards with Lord Flapoon, and a little old man with snowy white hair and spectacles so thick that his eyes had vanished almost into nothingness. "This, sire, is Professor Frowdisham," said Flapoon, as the mole-like little man made a deep bow to the king. "What he doesn't know about Ickabogs isn't worth knowing." "How is it that I've never heard of you before, Professor Frowdisham?" asked the king, who was thinking that if he'd known the Ickabog was real enough to have its own expert, he'd never have gone looking for it in the first place. "I live a retired life, Your Majesty," said Professor Frowdisham, with a second bow. "So few people believe in the Ickabog that I've formed the habit of keeping my knowledge to myself." King Fred was satisfied with this answer, which was a relief to Spittleworth, because Professor Frowdisham was no more real than Private Nobby Buttons, or indeed old Widow Buttons in her ginger wig who'd howled at Nobby's funeral. The truth was that beneath the wigs and the glasses, Professor Frowdisham and Widow Buttons were the same person. Lord Spittleworth's butler, who was called Otto Scrumble, and looked after Lord Spittleworth's estate while he lived at the palace. Like his master, Scrumble would do anything for gold, and had agreed to impersonate both the widow and the professor for 100 ducats. "So, what can you tell us about the Ickabog, Professor Frowdisham?" asked the king. "Well, let's see," said the pretend professor, who'd been told by Spittleworth what he ought to say. "It's as tall as 2 horses. "If not taller," interrupted Fred, whose nightmares had featured a gigantic Ickabog ever since he'd returned from the marshlands. "If, as Your Majesty says, not taller," agreed Frowdisham. "I should estimate that a medium-sized Ickabog would be as tall as 2 horses, whereas a large specimen might reach the size of, let's see, 2 elephants, suggested the king. 2 elephants, agreed Frowdisham, "and with eyes like lamps." "Or glowing balls of fire," suggested the king. "The very image I was about to employ, sire," said Frowdisham. "And can the monster really speak in a human tongue?" asked Fred, in whose nightmare the monster whispered, "The king, I want the king. Where are you, little king?" as it crept through the dark streets towards the palace. "Oh, yes, indeed," said Frowdisham with another low bow. "We believe the Ickabog learnt to speak human by taking people prisoner. Before disemboweling and eating its victims, we believe it forces them to give it English lessons." "Suffering saints, what savagery!" whispered Fred, who turned pale. "Moreover," said Frowdisham, "the Ickabog has a long, vengeful memory. If outwitted by a victim, as you outwitted it, sire, by escaping its deadly clutches, it has sometimes sneaked out of the marsh under cover of darkness and claimed its victim while he or she slept." Whiter than the snow icing on his half-eaten Folderoy fancy, Fred croaked, "What's to be done? I'm doomed." "Nonsense, Your Majesty," said Spittleworth bracingly. "I've devised a whole raft of measures for your protection." So saying, Spittleworth took hold of one of the scrolls he brought with him and unrolled it. There, covering most of the table, was a coloured picture of a monster that resembled a dragon. It was huge and ugly, with thick black scales, gleaming white eyes, a tail that ended in a poisonous spike, a fanged mouth large enough to swallow a man, and long, razor-sharp claws. "There are several problems to overcome when defending against an Ickabog," said Professor Faudisham, now taking out a short stick and pointing it in turn to the fangs, the claws and the poisonous tail. "But the most difficult challenge is that killing an Ickabog causes 2 new Ickabogs to emerge from the corpse of the first." "Surely not," said Fred faintly. "Oh yes, Your Majesty," said Faudisham. "I've made a lifelong study of the monster, and I can assure you that my findings are quite correct." "Your Majesty might remember that many of the old tales of the Ickabog make mention of this curious fact," interjected Spittleworth, who really needed the king to believe in this particular trait of the Ickabog, because most of its plan relied on it. "But it seems so unlikely," said Fred weakly. "It does seem unlikely on the face of it, doesn't it, sire?" said Spittleworth with another bow. "In truth, it's one of those extraordinary, unbelievable ideas that only the cleverest people can grasp, whereas common folk, stupid folk, sire, giggle and laugh at the notion." Fred looked from Spittleworth to Flapoon to Professor Faudisham. All 3 men seemed to be waiting for him to prove how clever he was, and naturally he didn't want to seem stupid, so he said, "Yes. Well, if the professor says it, that's good enough for me, but if the monster turns into 2 monsters every time it dies, how do we kill it?" "Well, in the first phase of our plan, we don't," said Spittleworth. "We don't?" said Fred, crestfallen. Spittleworth now unrolled a second scroll, which showed a map of cornucopia. The northernmost tip had a drawing of a giant Ickabog on it. All around the edge of the wide marsh stood 100 little stick figures holding swords. Fred looked closely to see whether any of them was wearing a crown, and was relieved to see that none were. "As you can see, Your Majesty, our first proposal is a special Ickabog Defence Brigade. These men will patrol the edge of the marshlands to ensure that the Ickabog can't leave the marsh. We estimate the cost of such a brigade, including uniforms, weapons, horses, wages, training, board, lodging, sick pay, danger money, birthday presents and medals, to be around 10,000 gold ducats." "10,000 ducats?" repeated Fred. "That's a lot of gold. However, when it comes to protecting me, I mean to say, when it comes to protecting cornucopia, 10,000 ducats a month is a small price to pay," finished Spittleworth. 10,000 a month? Yelped Fred. "Yes, sire," said Spittleworth. "If we're to truly defend the kingdom, the expense will be considerable. However, if your Majesty feels we could manage with fewer weapons—" No, I didn't say that." "Naturally, we don't expect your Majesty to bear the expense alone," continued Spittleworth. "You don't?" said Fred, suddenly hopeful. "Oh no, sire, that would be grossly unfair. After all, the entire country will benefit from the Ickabog Defence Brigade. I suggest we impose an Ickabog tax. We ask every household in Cornucopia to pay 1 gold ducat a month. Of course, this will mean the recruitment and training of many new tax collectors, but if we raise the amount to 2 ducats, we'll cover the cost of them too." "Admirable, Spittleworth," said King Fred. "What a brain you have! Why, 2 ducats a month. People will barely notice the loss." Chapter 22. The House with No Flanks. And so a monthly tax of 2 gold ducats was imposed on every household in Cornucopia to protect the country from the Ickabog. Tax collectors soon became a common sight on the streets of Cornucopia. They had large, staring white eyes like lamps painted on the backs of their black uniforms. They were supposed to remind everybody of what the tax was for, but people whispered in the taverns that they were Lord Spittleworth's eyes, watching to make sure everyone paid up. Once they'd collected enough gold, Spittleworth decided to raise a statue to the memory of one of the Ickabog's victims to remind people what a savage beast it was. At first, Spittleworth planned a statue of Major Beamish, but his spies in the taverns of Shoeville reported that it was Private Button's story that had really captured the public imagination. Brave young Buttons, who'd volunteered to gallop off into the night with the news of his major's death, only to end up in the Ickabog's jaws himself, was generally felt to be a tragic, noble figure deserving of a handsome statue. Major Beamish, on the other hand, seemed merely to have died from the accident, blundering unwisely across the foggy marsh in the dark. In fact, the drinkers of Shoeville felt quite resentful towards Beamish as the man who'd forced Nobby Buttons to risk his life. Happy to bow to the public mood, Spittleworth had a statue of Nobby Buttons made and placed it in the middle of the largest public square in Shoeville. Seated on a magnificent charger with his bronze cloak flying out behind him and a look of determination on his boyish face, Buttons was forever frozen in the act of galloping back to the city within the city. It became fashionable to lay flowers around the statue's base every Sunday. One rather plain young woman who laid flowers every day of the week claimed she'd been Nobby Button's girlfriend. Spittleworth also decided to spend some of the gold on a scheme to keep the king diverted, because Fred was still too scared to go hunting in case the Ickabog had sneaked south somewhere and pounced on him in the forest. Bored of entertaining Fred, Spittleworth and Flapoon had come up with a plan. "We need a portrait of you fighting the Ickabog, sire. The nation demands it." "Does it really?" said the king, fiddling with his buttons, which that day were made of emeralds. Fred remembered the ambition he'd formed the morning he'd first tried on battle dress of being painted killing the Ickabog. He liked this idea of Spittleworth's very much, so he spent the next 2 weeks choosing and being fitted for a new uniform, because the old one was much stained by the marsh and having a replacement jewelled sword made. Then Spittleworth hired the best portrait painter in Cornucopia, Malik Motley, and Fred began posing for weeks on end for a portrait large enough to cover an entire wall of the throne room. Behind Motley sat 50 lesser artists, all copying his work so as to have smaller versions of the painting ready to deliver to every city, town and village in Cornucopia. While he was being painted, the king amused Motley and the other artists by telling them the story of his famous fight with the monster, and the more he told the story, the more he found himself convinced of its truth. All of this kept Fred happily occupied, leaving Spittleworth and Flapoon free to run the country and to divide up the trunks of gold left over each month, which were sent in the dead of night to the 2 lords' estates in the country. But what, you might ask, of the 11 other advisers who'd worked under Herringbone? Didn't they think it odd that the chief adviser had resigned in the middle of the night and never been seen again? Didn't they ask questions when they woke up to find Spittleworth in Herringbone's place? And most importantly of all, did they believe in the Ickabog? Well, those are excellent questions, and I'll answer them now. They certainly muttered among themselves that Spittleworth shouldn't have been allowed to take over without a proper vote. 1 or 2 of them even considered complaining to the king. However, they decided not to act, for the simple reason that they were scared. You see, royal proclamations had now gone up in every town and village square in Cornucopia, and all written by Spittleworth and signed by the king. It was treason to question the king's decision, treason to suggest that the Ickabog might not be real, treason to question the need for the Ickabog tax, and treason not to pay your 2 ducats a month. There was also a reward of 10 ducats if you reported someone for saying the Ickabog wasn't real. The advisers were frightened of being accused of treason. They didn't want to be locked up in a dungeon. It really was much more pleasant to keep living in the lovely mansions which came with the job of adviser, and to continue wearing their special adviser robes, which meant they were allowed to go straight to the head of the queue in pastry shops. So they approved all the expenses of the Ickabog Defence Brigade, who wore green uniforms, which Spittleworth said hid them better in the marshweed. The brigade soon became a common sight, parading through the streets of all cornucopia's major cities. Some people might wonder why the brigade was riding through the streets waving at people, instead of remaining up in the north where the monster was supposed to be, but they kept their thoughts to themselves. Meanwhile, most of their fellow citizens competed with each other to demonstrate their passionate belief in the Ickabog. They propped up cheap copies of the painting of King Fred fighting the Ickabog in their windows and hung wooden signs on their doors which bore messages like "Proud to pay the Ickabog tax" and "Down with the Ickabog, up with the king." Some parents even taught their children to bow and curtsy to the tax collectors. The Beamish house was decorated in so many anti-Ickabog banners that it was hard to see what the cottage looked like beneath. Bert had returned to school at last, but to Daisy's disappointment, he spent all his breaks with Roderick Roach, talking about the time when they would both join the Ickabog Defence Brigade and kill the monster. She'd never felt lonelier and wondered whether Bert missed her at all. Daisy's own house was the only one in the city within the city that was entirely free of flags and signs welcoming the Ickabog tax. Her father also kept Daisy inside whenever the Ickabog Defence Brigade rode past, rather than urging her to run into the garden and cheer like the neighbours' children. Lord Spittleworth noticed the absence of flags and signs on the tiny cottage beside the graveyard, and filed that knowledge away in the back of his cunning head, where he kept information that might one day prove useful. Chapter 23. The Trial. I'm sure you haven't forgot those three brave soldiers locked up in the dungeons who refused to believe in either the Ickabog or in Nobby Buttons. Well, Spittleworth hadn't forgotten them either. He'd been trying to think up ways to get rid of them without being blamed for it ever since the night he'd imprisoned them. His latest idea was to feed them poison in their soup and pretend they died of natural causes. He was still trying to decide on the best poison to use when some of the soldiers' relatives turned up at the palace gates, demanding to speak to the king. Even worse, Lady Islander was with them, and Spittleworth had the sneaking suspicion she'd arranged the whole thing. Instead of taking them to the king, Spittleworth had the group shown into his splendid new chief advisor's office, where he invited them to sit down. "We want to know when our boys are going to stand trial," said Private Ogden's brother, who was a pig farmer from just outside Baronstown. "You've had them locked up for months now," said the mother of Private Wagstaff, who was a barmaid in the Jeroboam Tavern. "And we'd all like to know what they're charged with," said Lady Islander. "They're charged with treason," said Spittleworth, wafting his scented handkerchief under his nose with his eyes on the pig farmer. The man was perfectly clean, but Spittleworth meant to make him feel small, and I'm sorry to say he succeeded. "Treason?" repeated Mrs. Wagstaff in astonishment. You won't find more loyal subjects of the king anywhere in the land than those three." Spittleworth's crafty eyes moved between the worried relatives, who so clearly loved their brothers and sons very deeply, and Lady Islander, whose face was so anxious, and a brilliant idea flashed into his brains like a lightning strike. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. He didn't need to poison the soldiers at all. What he needed was to ruin their reputations. "Your men will be put on trial tomorrow," he said, getting to his feet. "The trial will take place in the largest square in Shoeville, because I want as many people as possible to hear what they have to say. Good day to you, ladies and gentlemen." And with a smirk and a bow, Spittleworth left the astonished relatives and proceeded down into the dungeons. The three soldiers were a lot thinner than the last time he'd seen them, and as they hadn't been able to shave or keep very clean, they made a miserable picture. "Good morning, gentlemen," said Spittleworth briskly, while the drunken warder snoozed in a corner. "Good news! You're to stand trial tomorrow." "And what exactly are we charged with?" asked Captain Goodfellow suspiciously. "We've been through this already, Goodfellow," said Spittleworth. "You saw the monster on the marsh and ran away instead of staying to protect your king. You then claim the monster isn't real to cover up your own cowardice. That's treason." "It's a filthy lie," said Goodfellow in a low voice. "Do what you like to me, Spittleworth. but I'll tell the truth." The other two soldiers, Wagstaff and Ogden, nodded their agreement with the captain. "You might not care what I do to you," said Spittleworth, smiling, "but what about your families? It would be awful, wouldn't it, Wagstaff, if that barmaid mother's of yours slipped on her way down into the cellar and cracked open her skull, or Ogden, if your pig farming brother accidentally stabbed himself with his own scythe and got eaten by his own pigs, or," whispered Spittleworth, moving closer to the bars and staring into Goodfellow's eyes, "if Lady Islander were to have a riding accident and break her slender neck." You see, Spittleworth believed that Lady Islander was Captain Goodfellow's girlfriend. It would never occur to him that a woman might try and protect a man to whom she'd never even spoken. Captain Goodfellow wondered why on earth Lord Spittleworth was threatening him with the death of a Lady Islander. True, he thought her the loveliest woman in the kingdom, but he always kept in mind himself because cheesemakers' sons didn't marry ladies of the court. "What has Lady Islander got to do with me?" he asked. "Don't pretend, Goodfellow," snapped the chief adviser. "I've seen her blushes when your name is mentioned. Do you think me a fool? She has been doing all that she can to protect you, and I must admit it is down to her that you're still alive. However, it is the Lady Islander who'll pay the price if you tell any truth but mine tomorrow. She saved your life, Goodfellow. Will you sacrifice hers?" Goodfellow was speechless with shock. The idea that Lady Islander was in love with him was so marvellous that it almost eclipsed Spittleworth's threats. Then the captain realised that in order to save Islander's life, he would have to publicly confess to treason the next day, which would surely kill her love for him stone dead. From the way the colour had drained out of the three men's faces, Spittleworth could see that his threats had done the trick. "Take courage, gentlemen," he said. "I'm sure no awful accidents will happen to your loved ones as long as you tell the truth tomorrow." So notices were pinned up all over the capital announcing the trial, and the following day an enormous crowd packed itself into the largest square in Shoeville. Each of the three brave soldiers took it in turns to stand on a wooden platform while their friends and families watched, and one by one they confessed that they'd met the Ickabog on the marsh and had run away like cowards instead of defending the king. The crowd booed the soldiers so loudly that it was hard to hear what the judge, Lord Spittleworth, was saying. However, all the time Spittleworth was reading out the sentence, life imprisonment in the palace dungeons, Captain Goodfellow stared directly into the eyes of Lady Islander, who sat watching high in the stands with the other ladies of the court. Sometimes two people can tell each other more with a look than they could tell each other with a lifetime of words. I will not tell you everything that Lady Islander and Captain Goodfellow said with their eyes, but she knew now that the captain returned her feelings, and he learnt, even though he was going to prison for the rest of his life, that Lady Islander knew he was innocent. The three prisoners were led from the platform in chains, while the crowd threw cabbages at them and then dispersed, chattering loudly. Many of them felt Lord Spittleworth should have put the traitors to death, and Lord Spittleworth chuckled to himself as he returned to the palace, for it was always best, if possible, to seem a reasonable man. Mr. Dovetail had watched the trial from the back of the crowd. He hadn't booed the soldiers, nor had he brought Daisy with him, but had left her carving in his workshop. As Mr. Dovetail walked home, lost in thought, he saw Wagstaff's weeping mother following along the street by a gang of youths who were booing and throwing vegetables at her. "You follow this woman any further and you'll have me to deal with," Mr. Dovetail shouted at the gang, who seeing the size of the carpenter, slunk away. And that's where we're going to leave it for today.